Okay, welcome. So we're joined today by Josh, who reached out to us on one of the last episodes and sorry, excuse me, in the Thinkers episode, and I think you were offering a bit more expertise than I had, as I kept kind of getting this concept wrong. I know I have an issue where I keep conflating the concept of death of the author and you know, divorcing the actual author from their work,
Right.
separation of art
Yeah,
from the author.
yeah, if it's
Um,
if it's
I,
any consolation,
I hear a
I don't think it's just you, and I blame Lindsay Ellis. And when I was doing all my
That's
research,
what I was gonna
yeah.
say. I hear a few people kinda keep doing this, and that was, kinda where I kept getting, yeah, I don't know if I got it from Lindsay Ellis, but, I wouldn't be surprised if wherever I got it from the zeitgeist came from that. They do seem like they're kinda similar topics and that they touch on the same
Yeah.
thing, but, I was clearly getting it wrong, and it was awesome that you reached out, so I would like to, understand it a little bit better.
Yeah.
So I guess let's, kinda give, your background a little bit, so that people can understand you're definitely more qualified to talk about this than I am. But yeah, if you're comfortable, what is kind of your background with the whole? It pertains to the death of the author
Sure.
idea.
Yeah. So I currently I'm finishing up my PhD and I'm studying theater. But before all that, in my undergrad,
Oh, cool.
I was sort of like I tell people, it's like a weird like double and a half major. I studied theater and English and got my teaching license. So I kind of had like a foot in,
Wow.
yeah, those like multiple doors. And yeah, got some of that literary theory, both as it applies, strictly speaking, to a text and reading, and then how it also kind of carries over, how it would transfer over to, yeah, things like theater performance, movies,
That's really
really
cool.
broadly, really broadly. So as people could maybe guess from my avatar photo here, I'm more focused on actually like ancient Greek theater, which is itself like
Hmm.
pretty divorced from a lot of this conversation, but just because it's out there and yeah, it permeates. I have a smattering. I'm by no means like yeah, these literary criticisms and theories are by no means my forte, but I know like enough that I can kind of keep up to.
It definitely seems like you know more than I do. Clearly, where I was conflating just separating the
Well, but it
art from the
is.
artist.
But it is, and I think that they are
It
kind of
is,
getting
but in a
conflated.
different way.
Yeah, yeah, and they
Yeah.
you mentioned that they are kind of related, and it's and I said only half jokingly that I blame Lindsay Ellis because it was when she was still active, she had a couple videos, I guess like 2 or 3 years now, and it seems like yeah, the like example par excellence for this conversation is of course J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter and
Yeah.
and in Lindsay Ellis's videos, because I had to rewatch those, do my research. She gives a pretty decent overview of what this idea is, and she properly cites who is credited with this French literary theorist critic Roland Barthes or Bart.
Hmm.
French is a weird language. I still don't quite understand all of it.
Yeah. I
Um,
definitely am not an expert on French
yeah,
either.
that's also not my forte. But he wrote an essay, a short article in 1967 with this title, the death of the author, La Mort de
Hmm.
l'auteur. That's my attempt at French. Um, and yes, while he's like credited with this, and yeah, rightly so. There, even before he coined this exact phrase, that kind of idea was kind of out there in like the 1920s and 1930s. Um, there were two sort of other schools of literary criticism going on. One of them more kind of in the Americas was this movement called New Criticism, and this is where we kind of get the
Mhm.
term art for art's sake. Like so much
Yeah, I've
before,
definitely heard kind of that.
yeah, exactly. Whereas before, previously the idea was like, well, hey, every piece of art, every work of literature, it has maybe like some didactic purpose. It's here to like teach something. It's
Mhm.
here. Whereas, and T.S. Eliot is the author that's yeah, kind of more the face of new criticism. He's written a bunch of things
Mm.
that say like, no, like this is just art for art's sake. And we don't need to like consider all these externalities. It can just be the thing that it is. And then also at the same time,
Mm.
there was the Russian formalists who were um, separately, but at the same time, arriving at a similar idea that just by reading closely a text, analyzing its literary devices, kind of understanding the forms, as you might imagine from the name, some of the structures within
Mhm.
there, that's where quote unquote the meaning comes from. And then those schools, kind of fell out of fashion. And then, yeah, a few decades later, that's when we get Barthes and some of the other um, structuralists, and then turning into post-structuralists is where deconstruction is kind of. So there's lots of all these other things that are kind of bubbling along. But then it is Barthes himself.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, like it does seem like kind of an idea that I don't know that I don't want to give Barthes credit for it. I'm just saying like it kind of feels like an idea that it seems kind of easy to stumble across to
Mhm.
like kind of take the meaning that's actually in the word, not what could the author have meant by this, but instead just what is the work saying. I could see arriving at a bunch of different ways.
Yeah.
So I actually didn't realize it was so recent with Bart's, but that's very
Yeah, well,
interesting.
and the essay, and I thought I read something too. Like it's pretty short. It's pretty accessible. You can find a PDF of it in English. But yeah, I think some of the
And I have no excuse. I really
no,
should have
it's
known
okay,
this,
man.
but
Because again,
I'll
this
be
is
looking it up after this.
well, this is things that only us like literature and theater nerds like know off the top of our head. But yeah, there's a I kind of went through and I pulled a few quotes here, and I won't read the whole thing verbatim, but yeah, he's basically talking about, and this is where, this is where he's basically saying we don't need to rely on the author to understand it, and even beyond that,
Mhm.
there really is no ultimate. And here's where like the postmodern deconstruction stuff comes in. There really is no like ultimate it. Here's a little quote. He says, "In the multiplicity of writing, everything is to be disentangled, nothing deciphered. The structure can be followed, run at every point and at every level, but there is nothing beneath." So it's not like there's some secret that if we read it close enough, if we understand it, if we just ask the author, hey, what's this thing about? Aha, this is like the one and only, the sole, the unique, the objective interpretation of this. Bart's is saying instead, no, like we just need to read and follow and make the connections that's already within the text. And that the other thing that he's really driving at too is like that's a much more active role for a reader to take as opposed to a more passive one where
Yeah.
it's just like, oh, okay, um, I'm going to read Moby Dick and have Herman Melville just like pour the knowledge into my head, as opposed to trying to untangle
Yeah.
it yourself as a
And
reader.
that really makes
Mhm.
sense. I don't know, like, that is kinda how we'd have to look at, like, classic works of literature where, like, we don't have the author to, kinda go off. I mean, I guess we might kind of look at what was happening around at the time, but, I mean, isn't that kinda how we have to approach, like, many works anyway? It just seems more like a modern thing where you would actually have the author or the author's words, intentions, like, somewhere to actually reference instead
Yeah.
of, just what the work is saying
the
itself.
the the other sort of idea that gets brought up a lot in favor of taking a death of the author approach, de-emphasizing authorial intent, is Shakespeare. Like we can't, because he's
Mhm.
400 years dead now.
Yeah,
Like we can't ask him, hey,
exactly.
what do you mean by this? And so,
Mhm.
and it's also interesting coming more from my theater background, where when you have a script and then you elevate that for a performance, that's a whole other layer of intervention that the director and the actors, where any
Mhm.
one line, like just the word of the line, doesn't tell you the whole story. You have to consider things like, yeah, the subtext, like, well, and we could go into Stanislavski here, like, what's the
Mhm.
motivation? Is this a line that's said with irony? Just because
Hmm.
that's the words on the page or on the script, it's a deceptively easy trap to fall into, to think, well, it just means what it means because there's so much else going on. And so I think that's also one of the allures of adopting the death of the author, um, uh, kind of lens in interpreting works.
Hmm. That's really interesting. So is it like controversial? Do a lot of like the arts, sorry, like theater specifically, since you do have to kind of come up with the intention and you do want a performance, do they enjoy the death of the author concept, or would you just kind of separate that from like if you're doing a play or something?
Well, in plays, it also gets very tricky too, especially when the playwright is still living. Um,
Hmm.
there's numerous examples, and I could go
Fair
into it
enough.
where, hey, Shakespeare is in the public domain. My kind of specialty, the ancient Greeks, they're in public domain, most of their translations. And so that's where you
Hmm.
get some just absolute genius director who says, no, I'm going to take Romeo and Juliet, but I'm going to subvert it or do this like that. And there's, strictly speaking, yeah, there's no like legal consequences preventing that from happening. Whereas you try to do something like that with a living playwright's text, with his or her
Hmm.
script, and it's like, no, that's absolutely misrepresenting what this play is. And
I guess we see that with like the adaptation of like a lot of novels to movies as
yes,
well. Like the author tends to not like the adaptation.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
They have a certain vision for him.
Mhm,
So
right.
I can definitely see that. And I bet that would be very intense in theater because it seems like you're working a little bit more closely with the end product there than you might as an author of a book to a movie.
Right, right. Yeah, and so it's very interesting. And I guess, like I said, that's one extra layer kind of on top, like taking a script to a performance that necessitates,
Hmm.
yeah, some extra interpretation, some figuring out what this play is doing, what the speech is doing in a play. And I guess when we're talking about things like, yeah, like Harry Potter or watching a movie, because I know one of the reasons why it was a stream that prompted this our meeting together was talking about Barbie and like the the
Yeah.
number of ways that here's what Greta Gerwig is saying she was trying to do with her script in her
Hmm.
movie. Here's how the audience followed along with her, where they were reading her authorial intent. But then,
Hmm.
we get all like the Kenosphere that is reading it a very different way. And
Yeah.
a death of an author approach would say, like, well, yeah, that's just as legit.
Hmm. Well, then I guess I had kind of been adopting it without realizing I was taking that. Just like with that movie in particular, I know I'm not the first person to see it, but I really do see it as some kind of like Rorschach test where
Yeah.
you really can put your own ideology in there. So I don't know. I'm kind of left not knowing what the intention is. I can see what both sides are saying when they're saying, it's either pro men, anti men. There's a lot of different interpretations of that. But
Right.
would that be so? Would I be doing it a disservice by saying, like, I can see how you could get either of these interpretations, but I think it intentionally leaves it vague? Would that be like going
Right.
against it since I'm kind of implying that on my own instead of just saying it's saying this?
I
I don't instead of adopting one of the positions, I should say.
No, I think. Well, here's the other thing too. I'm very much a pragmatist. I'm not a hardliner for yeah, like a biography. Or okay, I'll also here's some more. Like I hate to just throw a bunch of isms or
Oh, no, it's all
extra
good.
words.
We like the
Okay,
isms
no,
here.
fair enough. How it kind of makes sense to me, at least, is approaching a text. You can adopt one of three, generally speaking, ways to center where the meaning is. You can take an author-centered
Mm.
approach, which is biographical criticism, where we consider, okay, what is the author's intent? What's the circumstance
Mm.
of where they were living when they were writing this? So that you can go author-centered. Then you can go
Mhm.
text-centered, which is yeah, the more kind of new criticism and the formalism, where it's like, no, we don't have to necessarily take what the author wanted this thing to be. It's just all there within the text. So if we do a close reading, if we understand what it is, that's where the meaning comes from. And then the third is the
Mm.
is the audience centered. And so this is where
Mm.
Death of the Author maybe goes a little further than something like New Criticism. And the other sort of big term for this is reader response, where it's not
Oh.
it's not what the author wrote or made for a
Mhm.
movie. It's not in the text itself, but it's the interaction that the reader, that the audience has with it. What sort of connections you as a reader make when you're encountering this thing. And and again, I being a pragmatist, I can see that each of those has their objectives, has their own sorts of pursuits. And depending on
Mhm.
what one is ultimately trying to do, then yeah, they could be equally practical, useful, valid, however you kind of go about it. So yeah, when a
Fair
person
enough.
watches Barbie, or when two people sit down and watch Barbie and they walk away with very different interpretations of that film, well, that could be
Mhm.
the more reader response, where it's like, no, I thought it was going this way, I thought it was going this other one, versus if someone studiously track down every Greta Gerwig interview and really try to understand what she was,
Mhm.
that would be the more author-centered biographical criticism. So again, there
And it seems like there is
yeah.
some utility for doing that.
Mhm.
Like, so is there a situation where it would be better to kind of use death of the author than the author centered in form of like interpreting the work in terms of that?
I, I'm so, and at least coming from the theater sort of background, like
Hmm.
that seems to be almost the standard. Um,
Okay,
like you like
that makes sense.
yes, you do have to, when you make this licensing agreement with the publishing company and you write this contract, like, okay, I'm going to do X number of performances, I'm going to sell tickets at X dollars, and we're going to run for this many days.
Mhm.
And part of that is I agree to perform the script as it's written without any alterations, without adding anything, without taking anything out. So you have this legally binding contract. And yet
Mhm.
you have to have some freedom to tailor your performance to the specifics of your cast, to the specifics of the performance space. And so here's
Hmm.
where again, it can get super, super complicated with things like casting. With things like a very famous example, there's a playwright, Edward Albee, and there was a
Yep.
performance of his script, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and they were going to cast one of the actors
Yeah.
as a black man, and that is not in the script. And so there was this whole big legal battle where I don't know if he was still living or if he had passed away at this point. But yeah, there's a big legal battle of the publishing company saying like, no, we are you signed this contract saying you were going to perform the script as it is. This character is not explicitly mentioned as being African American. That dynamic would change the entire rest of the play, and so you're breaking this contract here. Um,
Hmm.
and yet there are some scripts that get so granular as uh, like a stage direction saying, oh, okay, at this point, the character has to walk in front of a table. There's some that get so very precise in their prescription,
Hmm.
but then there are others that are
Yeah.
more kind of hands off and say, like, well, here's the dialogue. The dialogue is what you have to stick to, but then actually, what the rest of it, the rest of the specifics, we are entrusting to you, the director, and the actors to kind of figure out. So I
Hmm.
think,
So are those contracts sorry,
oh
I
no,
know this is kind of like a side
no, that's
tangent. I
fine.
just, didn't exactly know about those contracts. So are they, like, a little bit more, individually tailored per, like, piece? Like, is
Mhm.
there some of them that are like you said, some are super granular, so can some be a lot looser? Like, it seems like there's been many adaptations, like, Annie, for instance. I
Yeah,
don't think, they traditionally, are or I don't think they're going with the same type of characters that they traditionally had
right.
before. Would that be like a loosening in that type of contract, or is that like something
Or a
special?
renegotiation when a
Oh, fair enough.
and especially for something like film. If it's gonna be a big film movie adaptation, then the production company gets in touch with the publishing company and with the originator of the work, and they say like, "Hey, this is an idea that we're having. Do we have your
Yeah.
do we have your
I
permission
assume it's
to go forward with
different
that?"
with, I'm so sorry for speaking
No, it's
over
fine.
you. I think it would be different with film because like, it's an adaptation. It's not
Mhm.
exactly like one for one where, like, like a traveling like, I know, like, To Kill a Mockingbird is still going around, like,
Yeah.
the country. Like, there are certain ones that, it seems like you don't really alter the performance, but, or sorry, you don't alter, the version that was penned by the author. But, I don't know. It just seems like there are certain plays that definitely have taken liberties. I was just when you mentioned that, contract, I guess, any contract is negotiable.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
I guess it would be different for each
Mhm.
one. Sorry for sidetracking on that
No, not at all,
tangent.
man. Not at all.
Um, so do hmm, so that is, rather interesting. So what would be, more of like, would you have, like, an example of, like, when, a work has been misrepresented due to, like, the focus on the author's intent? And I don't know. It
Oh,
just,
man.
yeah, I guess sorry, I'll stop the
No.
question there.
No, it is because you'd shared with me some kind of like guiding questions beforehand, and when I came to this one, I was
Yeah.
super stumped. I was like, man, is there one where it's like where
Yeah, I
it's
was
like
trying to think of
a
it because I can kinda see the opposite.
yeah, and I think that's it too. I think generally speaking, it's the author is going kind of one direction, and then more popularly, there's a different reading or something like that. But I was trying to think like, is there ever like has there ever been something where yeah, like the author didn't understand their own work or like what they were doing, and I I don't know. Again, it's super, super tricky. The only thing that I could like, I don't know, kind of maybe sort of think of is again, like maybe Barbie, where like
Mm,
it could be read like that, but then but also I think we've both kind of funneled around this, that
mm,
that adaptation seems to be
mm,
seems to be one of these places where it gets where yeah, things kind of bend a lot. So if a
for sure.
for so if a book is getting made into a film, that's the whole thing, right? It's like, ah, like the book's a lot better, but I know that there are film adaptations that are based on books that people don't even realize. They don't even realize that it's based on a book, because the movie, while it's doing its own thing and while it's different than what the author is, what the original author is doing, it still stands on its own as its own thing.
For sure.
So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's something where it's like, yeah, the author really thought they were. The only thing I could kind of sort of maybe think of was like The Room by Tommy Wiseau. Like,
Oh,
but then I don't know.
okay.
Like he was so focused
Yeah.
on like, no, this is what my thing is, and then it just kind of became its own thing. I don't know.
Actually, I hadn't thought about that. That is, yeah, actually, I think that might be like the perfect example
Yeah,
of that,
maybe.
actually.
It
Huh,
was
that's really
super
cool.
fascinating. I was glad to come across a question that like really stumped me.
Well, good. I'm glad I stumped you. I think that was actually one from Patrick.
Oh,
So
okay.
shout out to
Yeah.
Patrick. Wish he could be here. But
Right.
yeah, you're doing great work. Um, so kind of to backtrack.
Yeah.
So I guess you could have multiple death of the author interpretations of the same work. It's just how you're reading it on there, or would there be like a correct interpretation of a
Oh
work if
man.
you're using that death of the author technique? Like if we're going back to Barbie, for instance,
Yeah.
Ben Shapiro interprets it one way, but I've also heard,
Mhm.
it's actually the opposite of his interpretation from quite a few
Yeah,
others.
I think that's just
Are
it.
either of them correct if they're not bringing in like Greta Gerwig or anything? They're just going off of what they see.
Well, and that is honestly one of the criticisms, I suppose you could say, about this reader response theory, or this yeah, death of the author kind of lens is, and you
Hmm.
mentioned this before, the kind of metaphor of the ink blot or like the Rorschach test.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is this something that a person is reading into the film or reading into the book, the diegesis, or is this something that
Mm-hmm.
is coming out of it um, as a more exegesis? It's if the bounds that you're placing on a work are just your own experiences, then that's super limiting. And like there's not even the potential for a symbol to mean something outside of your experience. Because if the only
For sure.
basis that you're going through, the only basis that you're using to support your interpretation is your own experiences, then yeah, that's by definition like super limiting. You're cutting off an entire rest of other human experiences, other cultural foundations, and and you kind of see that too with like, you know, here's also related to adaptation is this idea of appropriation. And if
Mm-hmm.
something is appropriated or misappropriated or malappropriated, if we're going to take a classic fairy tale and then jam it into a certain ideological lens, because that's what, because hey, that, because we don't have to worry about what the author says, that can be one of the downsides as well. And yeah, and that there's a multiplicity of it. There are as many different readings of a text under reader response as there are readers. Like I was this, oh man, I had almost kind of like memory hold this. I just flashed back to like taking some high school English classes, and we were reading an ancient Greek poem. Yeah, this was Sappho. Yeah, we were reading Sappho. This
Oh,
the
wow.
poetess.
It sounds like you had a much better education than I
Well,
did. We definitely were not reading ancient Greek
well,
in my
it was in
high school. That's
English.
awesome.
It wasn't in Greek. It was
Mhm.
an English translation. And I had some high school classmates in this advanced English course reading an ancient Greek poetess, but they were reading it through a Christian lens, and they were saying like, "Oh no, this is like an allegory
Hmm.
for some Christian thing." It's like, what? This predates Christianity by like 500 years.
Well,
But
but it could have been.
I don't. But then they would say
Yes.
like, "Well, no, she was just being inspired by." So and
Yes, I was gonna say divinely
right,
inspired. Even
exactly.
it was all a matter of.
Exactly right.
It
She
was a
just didn't know.
plan.
She was, yeah. So it was, so that's where it can get a little off the rails, so to speak.
Mm,
If it's whatever the and I also kind of saw this word come up too. Yeah, if it's up to the subjective experience of the reader, then yeah, then there's no bounds. Versus kind of
mm,
finding a happy medium between, yes, the subjective experiences I have reading this thing versus some of the objective facts of when it was first produced, what historical cultural context it was first produced in. So
mm.
and that's also, I guess, sort of my pragmatism shining through as well. I like to kind of sample a little bit of each, take little pieces from these different approaches, and I think that does afford a much richer, a much more meaningful engagement with yeah, a movie, a play, a novel, a poem, whatever.
That makes sense. That definitely makes a lot of sense. Um, so I guess I'd ask you question three on here is how do you balance acknowledging an author's background, experience, and the societal context with the idea that the text should stand alone in interpretation?
Yeah, one of the first responses that came to mind as I was thinking about is when I was thinking about that sort of question, how can we balance, yeah, the
Hmm.
historical givens about when a thing was written, when a thing was produced, is I think of this semi running joke about um, how many stories, how many movie plots, even only back into like the 80s, how many movie plots could have been resolved if the characters had cell phones,
Yeah,
and so
a good portion, and like every
exactly.
sitcom,
Yeah, like how
practically every episode would have been over
right, like,
just a phone call.
one of the big ones, that also kinda gets brought up is, like, Romeo and Juliet could have been just avoided so
Oh,
much, just like, "Hey,
yeah,
I'm
if they
actually
had
not
text,
dead,"
it would have been great.
you know? And so it is, it's
Yeah,
so
that actually makes a lot of
and
sense.
and so, yeah, and so I think, yeah, understanding the context of, going back, ancient Greeks, Sophocles, very famous tragedian, uh actually my avatar photo here is from a kind of famous or infamous production of his play, his tragedy, Oedipus the King, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus Tyrannus. Like how many, like a simple blood test could have could have really cleared some things up early on. But darn it, in his historical Greece, they didn't just have that. Um, and so yeah, I think there's a richness too of expanding one's horizons, getting out of what is familiar or comfortable with one, and yeah, trying to understand a piece of art for what it to the best of our ability, because I'll never truly know what Sophocles or what an Athenian sitting in a theater in 430 BCE, like I can't understand what their response was, but I can at least kind of push my own. I can try to get out of what just automatically comes to me by learning more about,
Hmm.
okay, well, what was Athens like in the middle of the fifth century, or
So,
yeah.
do does that often happen in theater? Like, would they go back to what was happening at the time that this play is based, or that this, whatever the work
Mhm.
is, like, if it's a period piece, would they
Right.
actually study the history? Or is that more of like a personal thing that you're
So
doing?
it does. Again, it largely depends on what the director is trying to do with his or her production
Mm.
concept. If they're wanting to do a more period thing, if they're wanting to do Shakespeare, but on a Martian planetary base. I don't know, but yeah, there
Yeah.
is an entire sort of field in theater called dramaturgy, where it's basically that
Hmm.
it's researching. Okay, this play is set in Paris in 1915. What are all the details of that? What's the architecture look like? What do some of the hand props look like? If they're like drinking wine, what sort of wine glass would be period appropriate or not? Um, Lots and lots of things like that. And I think there is, again, because in theater specifically, there is that contract where it's like, okay, we are agreeing
Hmm.
to present this play as it's written, but if we want to make changes, we'll make those arrangements beforehand. Um, and so yeah, I think there does tend to be more of the quote unquote doing your homework, and
Hmm.
finding the cultural idiosyncrasies about what this piece is. And then even beyond that, then I would argue that the truly great works of writing both have those idiosyncrasies, but they also speak to something unavoidable or universal about what it is to be human. Because hey, Sophocles was still a human. Virgil was still a human, even though ancient Greece and ancient Rome
Hmm.
were so different. They're, yeah, on the one hand so very different to what we're going through in 2023, but then there's also so much that's just so familiar. And same for Shakespeare, same for Murasaki and the Tale of Genji, same for Cervantes and Don Quixote. Like there is eh, and maybe even universal isn't quite it, but there is something fundamental about being human and the human condition that I would argue that the truly great works of writing can tap into that, as well as speak to the specific conditions of when they were first created, composed.
Hmm. Well, kind of that's a really interesting answer. That kind of wasn't where I thought that would go, but that's really
Yeah,
interesting.
I mean, I don't
I
know.
guess kind of speaking on that humanness and that personalness, are there instances where the author's like personal life becomes
Mm.
particularly relevant to the interpretation, despite the death of the author principle? Like, are there times where you'd kind of want to do a hybrid one, or
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think
I guess you know what I'm trying to say. I feel like I'm stumbling over the
no, no,
question.
no. I think I do. If it's, I think the most obvious kind of one is if it's any kind of autobiographical work, if it's like a memoir, if it's a play that is like based on the playwright's life. Very famous American playwright August Wilson. He has several plays that kind of speak to his experience um, growing up as a black man in the United States in the 20th century. One of his most famous plays is called Fences. And there was a movie,
Oh yeah,
yeah, there's
yeah.
a movie adaptation with Denzel Washington and was it Angela Bassett?
Hmm.
Um,
Think
I
so,
think
but
so.
I could be incorrect. But
It
I
could
know it
be.
was Denzel for
But
sure.
yeah, and so the details of that play being being that August Wilson grew up in Pittsburgh, that play is it's not explicitly set in Pittsburgh, but you can read the details and see that it's based upon those experiences that he had growing up or the people he knew growing up. And so a lot of times that play Fences gets juxtaposed with Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman because both of those plays
Mhm.
are sort of about the false promise of the American dream. And August Wilson was very adamant about no, you can't just perform Death of a Salesman and cast it with black actors. Because what Willie Loman,
Mm,
as a white man, what his experiences are in that play are fundamentally changed if you cast black actors. Likewise, my play
mm,
Fences is specific to the experiences of an African American family in Pittsburgh in the 1950s. Um, and so you can't. He was very much against colorblind casting, um, and that would also include taking a Shakespearean play and doing some colorblind casting with that. He said no. He was of the mind that no, those works, the the characteristics the of the characters. I know it's kind of redundant there. Those characters are written a certain way, and we can't just and to do any sort of colorblind casting just really muddies the water. And he has
mm.
he has another sort of famous essay called "The Ground on Which I Stand," where he lays out that argument as well. And he says like no, like
Huh.
the plays are written a certain way. And again, and I think it's especially the case for any sort of autobiographical or semi autobiographical work. It's like no, like this is a play that's about my life experiences, and so yeah, you kind of need to go with what I intend it to be, as opposed to trying to subvert it or
Mm.
do any sort of cute casting things. So yeah, I think that's the big one where it's especially if the work is autobiographical, you kind of have to follow what the author is saying.
Fair enough. I mean, I guess there are, like weird. I'm trying to think of like an odd biopic. I guess the one that comes to mind is
Mm.
like that Weird Al one where it's,
Oh
it's a
yeah,
little bit more fantasy than like a biopic or whatever. That
right.
probably doesn't apply as much there. It seems like they're not actually telling his real story there, so it is more for comedic purposes. I can't think of any that are grossly exaggerated. I mean, I guess you could argue that like almost every biopic or whatever is exaggerated in some way,
Mhm.
but that is interesting. So is it? Nah, I guess that doesn't matter. I was gonna go on a weird tangent, but
Nah,
let's stick with
no no
where
no.
we're going on
Let's
this
do
one.
it. I'm all about
Well, it
getting
was just
weird.
kind of so if that author was against kind of any sort of funny casting or anything like that, like he wanted more exactly how the author wrote it. I mean, like the original Shakespearean plays, like they were all performed by men, though, right?
Mhm,
So,
right.
like, isn't that kind of against classical? Although it's not like plays have been only men for quite a long time. So,
Right.
it does seem like that would be still very classical to have the character actually portrayed by the
Mhm.
person that is that embodies the character
Yeah.
rather than
So
changing that. Uh, sorry, go
well, I
right
was
ahead.
just at the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London, which is sort of a
Mhm.
reconstruction of yeah those 15th and then no, excuse me, 16th and 17th century playhouses. Every once in a while, they will do a play following those original conventions, and 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 it does. It's not. I mean, some would probably argue that like that is closer, like going to one of those original plays with costume and even returning to this kind of reconstructed what we think the original pronunciation was, as opposed to like a more
Hmm.
modern received pronunciation. I think there's a lot of value in that, and at the same time, I appreciate my kind of whole thing, especially with theater, but also with just art in general, is just yes more. Like let's have
Hmm.
more interactions with these texts. Let's try out different things, and then when some of the concepts don't exactly stitch together, when some things kind of fall apart, when some things are messy and sloppy, well then yeah, let's open that up and talk about it, and not like drag anyone, but say like, okay, this is
Hmm.
uh, that was a choice. That was a bold choice that you made there.
Yeah.
So I think there is something to be said about. So yeah, not only like Shakespeare and the Greeks for that matter also were
Yeah,
only
for
men.
sure.
But yeah, they had outdoor theaters. So to like do a play in a proscenium indoor theater, that even that's a whole level removed because the stages were physically different too. So yeah, I'm again, man. I just put it out there. Put whatever you have in mind out there, and then let's see kind of what falls into place.
That makes sense. Um, Kind of a weird tangent on this tangent. Would most people argue that the authorial intent, since they knew that men would be portraying these, is to have men portray it, or
Yeah.
would you have the argument that they wrote female characters, so
Mhm.
their intent was to have Juliet portrayed as a woman? I don't know. I was kind of wondering what would people come down on the authorial intent on that.
Yeah, that's man. That is a great tangent, and yeah, the fact that we would read that performance convention very differently.
Hmm.
So yeah, it is a matter of to what degree is the audience willing to suspend disbelief just to play along with like, oh, okay, that's Juliet, who's yeah a
Hmm.
14-year-old boy, but done in makeup and wearing a dress and maybe speaking in a falsetto or maybe just kind of speaking in their naturally high voice anyway. Do we just run with that? Do we suspend disbelief? Greek theater uses masks and only had three
Hmm.
actors portraying multiple characters, and so there's a whole other branch of study of like, um, yeah, let's perform these Greek plays using those conventions where we have three actors at most. And so you may have a character die in sort of one episode, and then that same actor comes back on to play the person who killed him. Like, isn't that some really interesting, like, interpretive ground to explore? Um,
That
so
is.
yeah,
And would people argue that it should be performed that way if the author knows that, like, that's how it was going to be performed? Like, if it is the tradition to have, 3
mhm,
actors in there, is that their intent,
yeah,
or do we just assume that their intent is to have everyone in the play represented?
yeah. Or is that one of those things too where the the author is limited by the historical
Hmm.
realities of their times? Like would I don't know, maybe Sophocles would be like, "No, let's do some CGI." Like, I don't know. I don't know.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never thought of
Maybe
that, but
yeah.
wow, they could be,
If yeah,
so
yeah,
that would be great.
if
Michael Bay does, classic Greek theater.
right, exactly. Exactly. So again, again, I think there's value in both. I think there's value in performances or interactions or adaptations that take the audience, that take the reader to the original. And I think there's value in taking the original to the audience, sort of extending that hand. Like,
Hmm.
okay, yeah, here, like, I hate the Romeo plus Juliet Baz Luhrmann.
I
I
was
hate
literally
that
gonna
one.
ask you about that, and I was wondering how to put that out. So is that, like, controversial? So, we are talking, like, the '90s one with, Leo DiCaprio, and it's kind
Yeah,
of set in a modern time?
it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
Um,
And they're driving
so it's weird
cars.
because,
Yeah.
like, they're still calling them swords and stuff, but they're guns. I don't know. In that would that be controversial, like, in the theater world, for essentially going against the intent, or would it be just it's a radical interpretation and
Yeah.
it's hip and new?
I should also clarify, it's not so much some of the it my objections are not so much some of those artistic reimaginings, if you will. I think it's awesome
For sure.
that, who is it? Is it Brian Dennehy who says like, "Grab me my sword," and reaches for a shotgun? I think that's awesome.
I think so.
It's just more
Yeah,
Baz
I always
Luhrmann.
remember the Leguizamo with his sword.
Yeah, it's just more Baz
But yeah,
Luhrmann
Baz Luhrmann is
in general.
mhm.
He's just way too much for me. Like I couldn't sit through Moulin Rouge. I couldn't do The Great Gatsby. It's just too. Which, like, yeah, I know I'm billing myself as a theater guy, but I'm like one of the most like laid back, chill theater guys that there is. But yeah, that's a perfect example. That's a perfect example of taking an ancient text to the reader, to the audience,
Mm,
and again, I think there's a lot of value in that. When I would teach,
mhm.
I was a high school English teacher, and so freshman year,
Nice.
Romeo and Juliet was one of the texts that we assigned to read, and some of the other teachers would pick different film adaptations. I think some years I did the Baz Luhrmann one, some years I did others, and even better, hey, let's instead of let's watch the same scene. How do these two directors approach the same
It would
scene?
be
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. So some of that comparative stuff as well. So again, as far as
Mhm.
like what one should do, what's the objective, what's the right, I don't know if we'll ever find answers to that unless we get so granular and so prescriptive in our directions, about doing a play or about writing a book. um, yeah, I think that's a pretty hard goal to achieve, and I think that there is a
Hmm,
lot of room for experimentation. And well, let's try reading it this way. Let's try reading that line sarcastically, and just see how
hmm.
that comes across. But yeah, it's. I just hope that
That
Baz
is
Luhrmann stays
really
away from Greek
interesting.
theater, because then that's just it'll be all over for me.
Well, yeah. It would be interesting. I'd kinda like to see it, but at the same time, I
Exactly,
can
right.
totally understand your point on that. Alright, I guess kinda getting back to the questions, are there instances where you think it's appropriate to kinda combine the elements of authorial intent and death of the author in the interpretation? It kinda sounds like you were saying, that's kinda what
Yeah,
you do personally, but,
yeah,
is that
that's
kind
kind
of
of
a
my,
standard?
yeah, that is my kind of personal take on it. I know, like without getting too much into the politics thing, one of the things that, yes, the arts tend to be more left leaning, and because we came across each other in the way that we did, it's probably not a surprise that I would count myself as an enlightened centrist.
Oh,
And
nice.
so
That's controversial now.
I
Apparently not
guess
everyone's,
so.
considering themselves
I
that.
guess so. But that's where I stand. And yes, I'm getting tired of seeing, yeah, like Shakespeare, for instance, and even some of the Greeks. I'm starting to get tired of seeing them continually pushed one direction,
Mhm.
continually force fit into holes that are trying to say one message that, again, and here's where a more close reading, a more maybe like new criticism or just textual approach, like you're trying to make a character say a message that they're clearly not. Um, one of
Mm.
my one of my personal examples with this is, there's a very famous Greek comedy, probably the most famous Greek comedy, in the English speaking world, and it's called Lysistrata. And just to
Mm.
give a real quick run through, so the Peloponnesian War, the like sort of civil war between these Greek city states, primarily between Athens and Sparta, it's been raging for 20 years at this point. There's no end in sight, and that is both. Again, here's this kind of funny thing. That is both the case, like the real world case of when this comedy was first performed, in Athens in 411, and that's the context of the play. And so the main character,
Mm.
Lysistrata, she gathers all of the other women. She gathers a bunch of women from Athens, from Sparta, from Thebes, from some of these other city states, and she says, "Girls, are you tired of this war going on? Yes, yes, we hate it. Do you miss your husbands? Yes, yes. I have a plan to bring peace. Will you do it? Yes, anything, please." And Lysistrata says, "Okay, we all need to agree, that until our husbands sign a peace treaty, we're going to stop having sex with them." And then all of the and
Wow.
then
So that was a tactic, I mean, I guess since the beginning of
you're
time.
right. And then all of the other
Wow.
women say, "Okay, do you have any other ideas though? Can you come up with maybe a different plan?" And it's a comedy and it's hilarious. And so so it is a play that when it gets produced now, it is always put into that kind of box. It's always presented as a pacifist anti-war play. In 2003, there was a whole global event called the Lysistrata Project, where as soon as the U.S.-Iraq war was going on, there were staged readings of Lysistrata across the globe, to demonstrate against the war, to call for peace. But when you actually look at the
Well,
play, when you
this just shows me, like, my blind spots, like, I was not aware of that at
but
all,
again,
and
this
I
is
really think I should have been.
no, who other than some moron getting his PhD in theater history would know about that? Like, there's much more important
Well,
things for
apparently
people to
people
know.
across the world, I mean, there was the whole global, movement
Yes,
to,
I
have a day
suppose. I
where everyone was
suppose.
reading it, like, I it feels like that would have hit my, radar at some
I
point,
mean,
but,
well, but
wow,
again,
I definitely need to check that out
yeah,
again, or check that out as
yeah.
well.
Well, and so that is how the play is presented, and because it's the women who are all coming together and doing this, it's also presented as like a proto-feminist play. Like, look at this play that's about like women taking charge. They not only have the sex strike, they also like infiltrate the Acropolis. They have an occupation of their own of the city's finances, so that the men can't recruit more soldiers and build more warships and things. And so it's presented as both a pacifist play and a proto-feminist play. But it's not, though. But it's really not. Lysistrata, the main character, she gives this long speech at the end, and she very explicitly says, "Hey, Greeks, we need to stop fighting each other because there are other enemies that we need to be ready for. There are other enemies that are just waiting for us to weaken ourselves so that they can swoop in. So, hey, let's stop fighting each other and more prepare for some of these other threats that are going on."
So
And
when people are misinterpreting or interpreting it as, like, the pacifist thing, are they taking that out or just kinda glossing over it?
it, I guess it kind of depends on whatever English translation they're using too. Sometimes,
Hmm,
if translators are going a little more literally and they're doing line by line, maybe that gets glossed over. Or if it's a
hmm,
more freely adapted work, maybe that line just doesn't even
maybe
appear
just
in the English
omit
version.
it. Hmm,
The and even that is itself kind of niche. But the other one
mhm,
that really kind of hamstrings a lot of performances that try to do a feminist message with this play is at the end, the Greek women bring their husbands back in, and they step out of the positions of power that they temporarily assumed. And that's another one that a
hmm.
lot of modern directors, when they try to make this comedy say something that, again, they don't know what to
They
do with.
changed the ending.
The very end of the play is
Hmm,
is is the women welcoming the husbands back into the citadel, back into the fortress, where they've cooked a lovely dinner for them. So they're just stepping back into their domestic roles. And a lot of modern directors, again, they either gloss that over, or they change, or they
or
alter
it'd
the
be a
text.
controversial ending.
Exactly. And so that's an example where you kind of have to have an understanding of both. And you better believe me, like I have an academic paper just like percolating in the back of my mind about Greta Gerwig's Barbie and Aristophanes' Lysistrata, and like, so it's
I
there,
could see
it's
that from how
there.
you're, describing
Yeah,
it.
it's
Yeah,
there.
that's kinda where my mind went to.
I just got to work on it. But yeah, so like, again, I think a director, an adapter, an audience member, a person just reading a text, they can really put themselves at some great risk, I think, if they don't, or if they don't put any weight at all into, well, what was this play really doing? Because Aristophanes, when he's writing this play, he wants the war to end. They've been fighting for 20 years. Th- so he has a political message in this play when it was performed in that context, which is very different than the Iraq War context. The Iraq War, when this Lysistrata grand global reading project happened, that war had just started. When Lysistrata was written, the Peloponnesian War had been going for 20 years, and that's a lot different too.
Mm,
Like that context doesn't capture the same. It doesn't resonate the same. So I think, yeah, I think a person opens themselves up to really having egg on their face when they have designs to make this big grand work of art, to speak this message, and then just have their legs come cut out from them because, oh no, wait, here's all these other things that are explicitly in the text that speak exactly against what
mhm.
what it is you say you're trying to do.
I guess that would always kinda be a problem with interpretation. You could always, be jumping to conclusions.
Yeah,
But,
right.
yeah, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Um, alright, I guess, yeah. Does the author, would the death of the author theory absolve creators from the responsibility of the messages
Mm,
and themes that are present in the work? Or I don't know, would it still be considering,
right.
would it still hold them responsible for it?
Yeah, this is this is also where it can get very tricky. And here's also where the adaptation versus appropriation kind of discussion comes into play. If you put something out, but then it's getting used for quote unquote ill purposes, or if it's saying a message that you don't want it to, yeah, do you blame the original author? Do you more focus on the people running with it? The example that immediately came to mind when I saw this question is Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel by
Yeah.
Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote this novel to be an abolitionist work of art. She was writing to end the institution of slavery, and also because there weren't things like copyright and intellectual property rights in the 19th century, there was a whole genre of play called Tom shows, where people would adapt her novel, turn it into a stage play, unauthorized, without checking with her, and would just make money that way. And of course, people were taking her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is an abolition novel, turning it into a stage play that would actually be presented as pro-slavery. And so yes, if a person adopts purely, if they're a death of the author reader response purist, they can't have any issue with that, because it doesn't matter what Harriet Beecher Stowe said her novel was about. This is the very end. This is the very last sentence of that Roland Barthes essay, The Death of the Author. And I think it just sums this up. We quote, "We are now beginning to let ourselves be fooled no longer by the arrogant, anti-frastical recriminations of good society in favor of the very thing it sets aside, ignores, smothers, or destroys. We know that to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." And so that's just it. Is if this is an approach that you take, then you have no grounds to stand on when you say, wait, those people are appropriating Uncle Tom's Cabin to be pro-slavery. And how many like think pieces and articles came out like, wait, my teenage son saw Barbie and now he's going to the gym and I'm worried about him. How many relationships ended because the girlfriend and boyfriend interpreted Barbie differently? If you take an approach that champions the death of the author, then you can't, be a surprised Pikachu face when when people run with that and do whatever they will. I've heard similar things. Or even like American Psycho. That's another one that's kind of memeing like that. No, like this is a role to be emulated. Same with American History X. That's another one that given a reader response, a death of the author approach ends up maybe like glorifying things that didn't intend to glorify in the first place.
The way that one ends, I could see getting the message that
exactly.
It's just it's a weird way to end it, but I could definitely see that thinking Edward Norton was wrong in that. But yeah, that's weird. So then, would you? I guess it is maybe not your place to tell what everyone should do, but in your opinion, like how should we address ethical concerns that arise from potentially harmful interpretations? Like if you were to interpret that as like actually Edward Norton's character is wrong, we should all be racist or whatever,
right.
or the Uncle Tom's Cabin one, like you're saying. I don't know. Perhaps it is above your pay grade, so to say, to tell everyone how we should interpret it, but I don't know. Like so if you do go off of death of an author, I guess there would be no regress for it. It's just any interpretation that you can get from the actual work would be correct.
Yeah, it is more, and yeah, I suppose I'm returning once more to that metaphor of the Rorschach test. Is if this is the thing that we're not trying to decipher what it means, we're operating under the assumption not that there's some hidden, buried message or idea that with careful excavation we can uncover. But if we're not doing that, and if we're saying instead, well, no, it's just however you kind of understand the pieces to fit together, then yeah, that is both very freeing in some ways, and it can lead to new understandings of old works or works that we thought were inaccessible, or
Hmm.
I mean, how many more people get to see at
Definitely
least,
see that.
yeah, at least how many people get to see at least Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet? I mean, is that something? Is there something to be said about that? Could that maybe
Yeah.
inspire people to follow up and read the folios? I don't know. Um,
I know it's definitely inspired somebody,
yeah,
and, it probably got somebody to actually, like, appreciate some of his work without actually going to the effort of reading it.
yeah.
Perhaps
Well,
that's a good thing, but I could also see the argument that that's not his intention, that's not how he wanted you to interpret that,
right.
so,
Well, the
I don't
the
know.
the other one that's also very personal for me, and I've ranted about this elsewhere, is so I'm currently studying ancient Greek theater. As a little kid,
Mhm.
I read all the Greek myths. I was super excited. And then in 1997, Disney's Hercules came out, and
Ah,
I was irate. I was livid. Like I was like 10 at the time. I was 10 years old, and walking out of the movie theater,
I could see that.
my fists were just balled, just clenched as tight as I could, because say what you will about Disney's
They took some
Hercules. Yeah,
liberties.
they again, I know we're already past an hour here, and I don't want to lead us down a whole other rabbit hole here. But like, yeah, and yet, okay, so that was my reaction to it. And yet, so many of the other people who are studying classics that I interact
Mhm.
with on Twitter, that was their gateway. That was their
I could
entryway.
see that as, like, actually inspiring.
Yeah,
So,
and
that is an interesting
and
argument.
and
Hmm.
I'm not going to, nor can I actually take that away from him. Like, I'm not going to be that like gatekeeper dude and be like, "No, you're a nerd because your first intro was Disney's Hercules." Like, hey, if that's how some people enter and develop a broader and more complex understanding of whatever work of art, then yeah, giddy up. Um, but yes, and so like many things, it with great uh literary criticism comes great responsibility, I suppose.
That does make
Yeah.
sense.
Well, but
Um,
and also
I guess I
just very quickly too, or I'll
goes.
try to keep it
Yeah,
quick, because I know right at the beginning we were talking about the conflation of death of the author with the
that was
art from the
actually what I was
artist.
gonna
Okay,
get back
look
to,
at
so that's
that,
awesome.
man. Look at
Yeah.
that. We're vibing.
I know I didn't put it on the list, but
No,
I
but
kinda
we
was hoping
are.
we'd touch back on that. So thank you
Well,
for circling back around.
well, so because that is also, again, also laying that at the feet of Lindsay Ellis, and some of her video essays have gotten millions of views. So she makes a kind of sneaky argument that I think, here's how she kind of arrives at marrying Death of the Author and saying, no, we need to consider the artist and their art. Um, she brings up this idea of a paratext. And it
Hmm.
and I had to like listen to this section like two or three times just to make sure that I understood her that I understood her clearly and was getting what she was going for.
Mhm.
So a paratext is something that's not within a work of literature itself. So yeah, like para, ancient Greek word. I'm actually surprised I didn't go down the ancient Greek etymology here, because that's also
Yeah.
my like,
I don't think
I
I'm
do that all the time. But
I
it's
don't think I'm
something
familiar with that. Would that be like author's notes or something
exactly.
in
So that
there?
would be like author's notes. That would
Okay.
even just be like the title. If there's any
Oh,
footnotes,
okay.
if there's a foreword, an introduction. So it's things around, thus para. It's around the text, but it's not directly in it.
Okay.
So there's another, again, all these French literary theorists. So that idea comes from a different French theorist. His name is Gerard Genet, and he
Yeah.
talks about that in a book. Oh, what is it? It's like the second interpretation, something like that. But so he talks about paratext and intertext and a few other things. And what Lindsay Ellis does when she sneaks in paratext is she includes things like interviews or
Hmm.
J.K. Rowling's Twitter presence profile. That's a really
Hmm.
expansive definition of paratext, and I
Yeah.
think that's where,
I could definitely see everything else that you talked about, like the footnotes, the
yeah,
author's notes, like anything like that, but wow, like actually including, like,
yeah,
interviews.
like
Does
interviews and
she
profiles.
have, like okay, so it is, like, profiles too. I was gonna say, does she also include things, like, before they ever got to this? But if it's profile, that does seem like it would be kind of your entire background, so,
Yeah, or
that's interesting.
and so I think that's where, and so by considering things like whatever J.K. Rowling tweets, if you're going to like
Mm.
force that into the idea of paratext, then that's how she can get. I think that's how she's kind of saying
Mm.
like, well, you can still use the death of the author and be critical of J.K. Rowling because you're not criticizing the author, you're criticizing this paratext. You're bringing this paratext into your understanding as well. So she's, I
Mm.
think, trying to have her cake and eat it too. She's trying to have it both ways. It's like, no, I'm
Kind of
not.
sounds like it.
I'm not considering author's intent. I'm just considering this tweet that the author did and lumping that into a paratext, just like
Mm.
the like notes on the dust jacket cover.
Mm.
And so I think that's where a lot of times, and then so I rewatched both of those Lindsay Ellis ones. I rewatched
Mhm.
one of the live streams that Adam and Sitch did, and even they kind of they had a moment where they were trying to discuss this very same thing too, about separating art from the artist, but then do you need to know the author's intent to understand? So even they kind of got swept up in it. And I
Yeah.
think that was the big hiccup. I think that was the big, by trying to like smuggle in, I'm 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 including author's intent, but I'm not calling it that. I'm calling it a paratext because it's not the author, it's a tweet, and I think that's where some of the confusion may have come from. Because
Mhm.
otherwise, generally speaking, I have no problem divorcing art from artist. Um, I don't.
I I feel like I have a weird contradiction. Like for most artists, I
Mhm.
don't. Like, for instance, I don't agree with like Stephen King's politics, but I love his
You're right.
novels.
Yeah.
Like they're
Mhm.
great. But when it comes to something like Cosby, like I don't know. Like I can't listen to his comedy that has nothing to do with
Yeah. Mhm.
the weird stuff he was
Sure.
doing. But I don't know, or like the Cosby Show. Like
Yeah.
for some reason, I just get this weird feeling when I see that. But someone like Michael Jackson, who some could argue is equally as
Mhm.
bad, I don't have that weird feeling when I hear like one of his songs. Like I hear Thriller, I'm just doing
Yeah.
the hands. I'm not thinking about. I don't know. It's weird. So I feel like I do have an internal contradiction.
Well, and
I'm not sure exactly where that would go.
yeah, and because yes, like knowing more about the author, the artist, um, can that absolutely color your understanding or your appreciation of work? Yes, of course. I don't think.
I think so.
I also, it would take a great deal of compartmentalization, to be able, yeah, just to like sit down and do a rewatch of the Cosby Show, for instance,
Yeah.
but the other sort of flip side, where it can, where maybe there is also some sort of conflation of these two ideas, is, so going all the way back to this idea of biographical criticism, is
Mhm.
it's not only the author's intent being encoded into the work, it's equally the idea that the work of art itself can give us biographical details about the artist.
Mhm.
So for instance, and in some cases that can very clearly be shown not to be the case, like going all the way back to Homer and the epic poems, there were
Mhm.
some classical scholars who thought that, well, Homer must have been there at Troy because he wrote about it. And it's like, no, that's that very, very demonstrably not the case. And so, yeah, to the extent that reading a work of art can tell us about the author, that we can sort of like backtrace, oh, here's like some some scene in the Cosby Show that really
Mhm.
showed us, what kind of person Bill Cosby was. That also gets very, that's also difficult. It's really, really difficult to say that, oh, I wrote a poem about peaches, therefore,
Mhm.
you can discern something about my life, some biographical detail about my life, because of this poem, other than the fact that maybe, yes, I did see the Super Mario Brothers movie. Um, but I think that that's part of it
Mhm.
too, is how closely a work of art and the person who made that work of art mirror or reflect or represent one another. Um, and this is something that Lindsay Ellis brings up in her, in those video essays, and I am 100% with her on this. And it's just like you're saying too. It's like people for whom Harry Potter was so foundational to their growing up,
Mhm.
and then seeing seeing these differences between their author, like, yeah, that would rock your world. Um,
It definitely
it,
could.
it definitely could. And again, I can't take that away from you. I can't, sit you down and say, no, you shouldn't feel that way. Um,
Yeah.
but then yes, but then to make to yeah, to stretch and make some of the conclusions that you try to make, and get a little sloppy with some of these terms like death of the author, like paratext. That's also, I think, that leads to more obfuscation than clarity, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Hmm.
Wow. I really appreciate how kind of in depth you've got on this. I think I understand it a lot
Okay.
better
Yeah.
now.
Sweet.
I guess just kind of a final question for you. Is there anything else you think people should know about the concept death of the author?
Yeah. I mean, oh well, I can say this too. There's
Oh
so
yeah,
so so this was so yeah this phrase came out of an article by Roland Barthes. Yeah, in '67. He followed up with two other works of writing that elaborate on this a little bit more. And so yeah, if this is something that you're interested in, people who are watching or
it
listening and
is.
want to follow up, they should, again, most of the stuff should be in English translation, and I think fairly readily available. One of these,
Cool. I'll try to link it in the
yeah,
description.
yeah, sure. One of them is called S/Z, and then
Mm,
the other work is called The Pleasure of the Text. And so he elaborates a little bit more about these, and he takes another approach to say that when you're dealing with the text, he says that there are two types of texts. There's a readerly text, which would, I guess, kind of fall more under the authorial intent. It's more passive. You're just kind of following along with this work, to try to, kind of understand it, and you derive some sort of pleasure from a readerly text. And then there's also this thing called a writerly text, where it's much more what he's talking about in The Death of the Author, where it's almost like, it's almost like the author threw a bunch of string out on the floor. And so, like, which, like, going back to that phrase, to that word he uses, detangled. And then your job as the reader is, you're not like digging deeper, but you're like finding these connections, and you're sort of seeing where it goes. And there's a different, deeper bliss that you derive
hmm.
as an active an audience in a writerly work. And I think, again, sort of like yes, but, or yes, and, like, sure, if you're just kind of passively absorbing something, yeah, of course. Versus if you take the approach like, oh, I'm free to, like, yeah, like, trace these threads and to make these connections on my own, and take a more active role in doing that. Well, then, yeah, that would, I think, kind of lend itself a little more favorably. And that's where, yeah, we get this explosion of video essays, of criticism, of trying to understand a series, of trying to understand a TV show. Um, I guess, kind of a little bit subverting. Like, he's not exactly like deconstruction, Derrida, postmodern. Like, he's
Hmm.
kind of, sort of, maybe, but it's not quite that level. But it's wanting the reader to take a more active measure, and then thus get a deeper enjoyment, a deeper experience, this bliss that you get from a from a writerly text that you don't get in a readerly one. So yeah, those are just two other, and they're longer. They're not just a nice, neat, tidy little essay, but some further reading, some more homework if you're interested in that.
I definitely am. That's really interesting. I definitely want to dig deeper. I thought perhaps I was just kind of. I thought I had a grasp of the concept, and yeah, since you kind of reached out, I realized just how surface level my knowledge was on this.
Yeah,
So
and
this
that's
has
not
been
a
really awesome.
yeah, and that's not a judgment thing. Again, it's I've been kind of elbow deep in this for the last, how many ever years. And that's the other thing too, is I I think I can speak to some of these terms, but also with a little bit of, like, distance. And I'm not like rah rah death of the author, or rah rah biographical criticism. I'm just like, yeah, this is stuff, and then you do you.
Because it kind of seems like you're using kind of like a hybrid.
Yeah,
I don't know.
that's
It
my
doesn't seem
more
like you're opposed to.
right.
That makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, yeah. Well, and
And that seems, it seems fair. I would
yeah,
say.
right.
It seems like you could definitely change the work by going hard into one or the
Mhm.
other. But yeah, I can understand doing kind of a hybrid
Yeah,
approach.
totally. And also just to say so yes, I am currently finishing up my degree. I'm writing at length. But I'm also more than happy to like
Awesome.
touch base with you later on if we want to talk about more stuff, if we want to go a different route.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah, we
great.
can definitely kind of collaborate. And you also mentioned too that Patrick couldn't make it this time, but hey, maybe
Yeah,
next time
unfortunately, it's
we can
stuck at
figure
work
something out.
today.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. So
That'd
yeah,
be great.
I
And
I really enjoy this. Really like chatting and I
yeah,
was picking up
same.
stuff too. I was I wasn't just my intention was not just to be like, all right, class, listen up. But no, this was a really good conversation, man.
Well, thanks. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, we'd love to have you back. And if you ever see anything that we're getting wrong, please point it out again. Because
No, not getting
yeah,
wrong, just
actually the
helping develop a
well,
different perspective. Not
fair
getting
enough.
wrong.
I was conflating two
There we
terms.
go.
They're related, but they're not the same.
Exactly. So,
But yeah, we were actually going to do like the first episode of the show as death of the author and cover that
oh,
concept. So I'm,
sweet.
I'm actually really glad that we didn't because yeah, my service level knowledge, I don't think it would have gotten to the depths that this conversation did. So I really appreciate
Yeah.
this. I've gotten a lot out of this.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I heard this from another scholar, so I'm crediting him. But if you like South Park, you'll like ancient Greek comedy. It's basically the same. You just kind of, like maybe you'll miss some of the references of like, oh, they're making fun of this politician, but it's just as raunchy. It's just as dirty. And yeah, if you find a good
That's awesome.
translation, yeah, Greek comedies.
I think I've also only like kind of surface level knowledge of that as well.
Because
I
again,
know a
why would
couple
you?
of them,
Why
but
would
yeah, definitely
anybody?
not South Park like. That's awesome. Advertise for me. Well,
Yeah, so
cool.
so if you appreciated some of the things, I don't know, some of the things I was bringing up, if I if I made you laugh at all, I do have a podcast with a friend of mine, and we talk about culture stuff. We talk about history. We talk cryptids. We basically cover all sorts of things and
Nice.
just pal around. So if you want to check us out, look for the Two Wizards podcast. We put out a show weekly. Actually, now that I think about it, the day that you and I are recording this is our third anniversary of doing this podcast.
Nice.
So
Congrats.
thanks.
That's really
It's
cool.
very cool.
It's hard enough for I think they say most podcasts make it to like 3 episodes or something. So that's awesome. We've been doing it for 3 years.
we actually we
That's
we
really
make
cool.
that joke constantly. It's yeah, like 50% of
Oh,
podcasts fail after 8 episodes, and
is it 8?
yeah,
Okay.
it's something like that. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. Definitely check us out. We were actually we're doing the Trojan War. We're getting horned up for mayhem on the
Nice.
Trojan War. So yeah, that's my little thing to shill, I guess. So yeah, Two Wizards podcast. We're on Twitter at Two Wizards Pod C1. Um, so yeah, that's my thing. That's my self promotion, I guess.
Perfect. Everybody, check it out. It's in the description down below. Make sure and sign up, subscribe to that.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. All right, well, hey,
Oh, yeah.
thanks a bunch.
I feel like I just stumbled over my